This is Classical Ideas with Greg Soden. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. As I've gotten older, I started to realize just how short one person's lifespan actually is. I also began to realize how many amazing books, films, records, countries, languages, cooking recipes, and radio shows there actually are, and how little time we have to look at it all. A few years ago, I got really into podcasts as a way to continually learn new things while doing random chores around my home, running, walking my dogs, or driving in the car. I love podcasts, as you can probably tell, because I have total control over the content versus merely turning on the radio or something like that. One podcast I discovered 2 summers ago is The History of Philosophy in India and The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Both are hosted by Professor Peter Adamson, and both shows offer world-class scholarly content to listeners free of charge on philosophical content ranging from the Greeks to the Islamic world to medieval philosophy to Indian philosophy. He's been going strong on his podcast channels since 2010, and he shows no signs of slowing down. I cannot recommend these podcasts enough, especially for people who are interested in philosophical topics or classical world content. This episode with Dr. Peter Adamson gets very nerdy on podcasting techniques. His favorite parts about doing a podcast about philosophy, discusses his driving motivations, and he talks about the future of the show, including his plans for the next few years. Taken from his bio at the LMU in Munich, where he is a professor, Peter Adamson's primary areas of interest are late ancient philosophy and Arabic philosophy. His 2 monographs deal with the Arabic version of Plotinus, the so-called theology of Aristotle, and with Al-Kindi. He has devoted articles to several figures of the Greek tradition, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Porphyry, and numerous philosophers of the Arabic tradition, including Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, and more. He has also edited and co-edited numerous books, including the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy, 3 further volumes in philosophy in the Islamic world for the Warburg Institute, several volumes for the Institute of Classical Studies, including philosophical themes in Galen, and Interpreting Avicenna, Critical Essays for Cambridge University Press. In 2012, Professor Adamson moved to the LMU from King's College London. He is also the host of the History Philosophy podcast, found at www.historyofphilosophy.net. Without further delay, here is my conversation with Peter Adamson. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. I'm here today with Dr. Peter Adamson, host of the incredible History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast. So, Dr. Adamson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on.
So I'm curious if you can just introduce yourself and your work and your incredible, wide-ranging project, the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.
Oh, thanks. So I am a professor of philosophy. I've been in the field for almost 20 years now, which is frightening. More than 20 years if you count grad school. I was a lecturer and then professor of philosophy in King's College London for 12 years. And then in 2012, I moved to the LMU in Munich. I'm still actually attached to the department at King's, but mostly my main job is in Munich. And in my day job, I do ancient and Arabic philosophy, or as I like to say, philosophy in the Islamic world. So those are kind of my areas of research and teaching. But then, as you say, I also run this podcast.
Awesome. So I I kind of want to go back a little bit. So when did you realize philosophy was the life for you? Like, do you have any like specific moments that jump out at you as like the crux of what got you into this lifestyle that you have?
Definitely, yeah. So I went to Williams College for my BA, and that's a liberal arts school, meaning that you obviously take classes in a wide number of disciplines, right? And I actually wanted to be an English major, but because I was at Williams, I was really forced to take classes in other fields. And really just out of curiosity, I took the Intro to Philosophy course. And by the way, I should have said before launching into this story that this is like the most cliched way of explaining how you get into philosophy there is. So I took an Intro to Philosophy course, read Plato, fell in love with Plato and philosophy, and the rest is history, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I would, it's not like after that one semester, I was like, oh, I'm going to be a professional philosopher. But I just started taking more philosophy courses. And then by the end of my BA, it was clear that I was more interested in philosophy than I was in literature. And actually, the two things kind of interacted because within the literature strand of what I was doing, I was actually more interested in medieval literature than anything else. And so then I had the idea of doing medieval philosophy. And I went to the University of Notre Dame to get my PhD because they were strong in that area.
What is some of your favorite medieval literature, if I can indulge in that for just a moment?
Well, actually, there's one text in particular that really got me into it, especially into the medieval philosophy part of it, and that's Dante's Divine Comedy, because Dante is interested in philosophy as well. And so, I had been taking other courses on medieval literature, so I read like courtly love literature, like The Romance of the Rose, which actually I've covered in my podcast recently. But the thing about Dante is that he's a poet, but he's also a philosopher, and he combines philosophical themes with literature in the Divine Comedy. In particular, there's a kind of scene where he goes to heaven and meets all these philosophers who are orbiting around like lights. And he talks to Thomas Aquinas, for example. And I just thought that was really cool. And I wrote my senior thesis about Dante, and in particular about philosophy in the Divine Comedy. And by the way, at this stage, I really didn't know anything about medieval philosophy. So I really went to grad school just kind of hoping that it would be interesting once I got there, and it was.
You sound like that's how I stumbled into grad school as well. I was like, well, what am I going to do next? I don't know. I guess I'll go to grad school. And I did, and it was an amazing experience, and I learned so much. What did you specialize in when you landed in a PhD program at Notre Dame?
I was actually anticipating that I would do a PhD in Latin medieval philosophy, and I had learned Latin in college on that expectation, really. But the thing is that the reason I wanted to do medieval philosophy, partially it was because I was interested in medieval literature, but it was also partially because I knew I wanted to do work in the history of philosophy, because that's what I really like doing, is reading these historical texts and trying to figure them out. But I wanted to work in an area of philosophy that seemed like underexplored, because I mean, like I said, I love Plato, but I thought, how am I going to come up with something to say about Plato that nobody's said before that's worth saying? And I thought, well, medieval philosophy is probably less researched, which is true. And then I had this further thought once I got to grad school and started finding out that there was Arabic medieval philosophy that influenced Latin medieval philosophy. I thought, well, that sounds like something that's really going to need research. Mm-hmm. I bet if I learned Arabic, I could start publishing on that area, and there'd be like no competition. Yeah. And even I could get published. You
could get published in every journal there is.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I really give my 20-year-old self credit here, because it turns out that was, I wouldn't say it was a brilliant insight. It was more like a lucky guess, given the little information I had at the time. But it was true. And in fact, I kind of stumbled into this field, which has been a real growth industry over the last 20 years. So I would say there are probably, the number of scholars who work primarily on philosophy in the Islamic world has at least tripled and maybe multiplied by 10 or something since I came into the field.
And you must be by now like one of kind of like the leaders in that field, sort of, right?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Nice. So was King's your first professorship out of Notre Dame?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, actually, they're very persnickety about who gets to be called a professor and who doesn't.
Sure.
So professor means what Americans would call a full professor, and so actually, when you first get there, you're a lecturer, and then you have to, when you're at a British institution, also a German institution, by the way, you have to constantly be careful who you're calling doctor and who you're calling professor, because you don't want to call a professor doctor because you're taking away their title.
Right.
Right. If they're only and you don't want to call a lecturer a professor, although that's better.
So
it's
what
better
do
to call
you,
a lecturer a professor than a professor a doctor.
So what do your students call you right now?
Oh, they absolutely call me Professor Adamson. If they don't, they call me Professor Dr Adamson.
Okay. Okay, great.
And in London, I used to just tell people to call me Peter because, an American, right?
Sure.
But I think if I did that here, the German students' heads would explode. So I don't even try.
Okay, so in 2010, you founded the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast when you were at King's, right?
That's right, yeah.
So why did you start this podcast?
Well, I have a personality flaw, which is that I have a very hard time not making the leap from the thought somebody should do this to the thought I should do this. So I was listening to a lot of podcasts myself, and because I'm kind of pathetic, so I'm a historian of philosophy, right? And I'm pathetic enough that most of the podcasts I was listening to were either about history or about philosophy. And it kind of just dawned on me that although I was listening to a lot of podcasts that I really liked, none of them were actually devoted to the history of philosophy, and especially none of them were devoted to the history of philosophy in a chronological way. And the history podcasts I was listening to, the ones I really liked, and here there was one model for me especially, which is called The History of Rome by a guy named Mike Duncan. And what I really liked about his podcast is that he went through the entire history of the Roman Republic and Empire down to the fall of the Western Empire. There's now another good podcast, by the way, the Byzantine History or History of Byzantium podcast, I guess it's called, by a guy named Robin Pearson. So actually, since your listeners are interested in the classical world, they should check those out.
Sweet.
But in any case, both of those podcasts, but the one I was imitating was really History of Rome. They go through the history just like at the snail's pace, like telling you exactly what happens almost like a year by year basis, to the extent that they would even break down, for example, the tactics that were used in individual battles, that sort of thing.
Nice.
And that really spoke to me as a historian of philosophy, because that's actually how I think historians of philosophy should do history of philosophy. I mean, I had this, because I work in these weird areas like philosophy in the Islamic world and even medieval philosophy, I work on all these thinkers that nobody really knows about. And so something that bothers me is usually when people teach the history of philosophy, they jump from like Plato and Aristotle to maybe Augustine or Aquinas and then to Descartes. So if you were taking an undergraduate intro class, or even probably if you were an undergraduate major, you went through your whole college career as a philosophy major, it's pretty likely that you wouldn't encounter any philosophers between Aristotle and Descartes other than maybe Aquinas, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe Augustine, maybe you'd read Anselm's ontological argument. That'd be about it. And I mean, if you think about that, like the distance from Aristotle to Descartes is like 2,000 years. So that's more than half of the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's only talking about Western philosophy or European philosophy or whatever you want to call it. And I do philosophy in the Islamic world, right? So, and I've always, something that's always struck me as a problem about teaching philosophy in universities and certainly in schools, like you're a school teacher, so
yeah.
You know this. You just don't have time to cover more than the so-called highlights, right?
Exactly.
And in fact, what that really means is that you're covering this handful of thinkers that everybody thinks are the highlights, but there's all these other highlights that are just as great and nobody knows about them, right? Mm-hmm. So just to give a couple of examples, I mean, if you've done the history of philosophy and you skipped Plotinus, Avicenna, Duns Scotus, Spinoza, Malebranche, and Simone de Beauvoir, then you didn't cover the highlights.
Right.
Right. because they're all highlights. But if you cover those people, then there's going to be a bunch of others that are just as important I could name for you that you also didn't cover. And we can play this game all day, right?
Well, and what's really interesting about that is I took a bunch of philosophy classes in college, and you are describing my undergraduate experience studying philosophy, like to the letter.
Exactly. Well, I'm describing everybody's experience of studying
Yeah,
philosophy.
I mean, all those names that you just mentioned, you were my introduction to learning that these people even existed while listening to your podcast in the summertime while I'm out on bike rides.
Yeah, right. And so that was exactly the idea. So I thought, even in my own teaching, okay, so I teach philosophy in the Islamic world, but even when I teach that, I don't do it in as much detail as I did it in the podcast. And the great thing about a podcast is that there's no one, it's not even like a radio show or a TV show where someone's standing over you saying you have exactly this many minutes to cover this much material. You just go however fast you want. And so I had this idea to just cover the history of philosophy the way that a history podcast would cover history. In other words, you don't skip, you just go from each thing to the next thing. Now, obviously, that's not really possible because it's not like I'm telling you about every argument in every text of every thinker, because if I had done that, I'd still be back with Plato like 8 years later.
Yeah.
But it's, the podcast is vastly more detailed than any course on history of philosophy at a college could be, for sure. And in fact, I often have to refer my own students to my podcast for like more detail. Like if you want to know more about this or about this thinker that I don't have time to cover, go listen to my podcast.
Yeah. Is it true you have over 11 million downloads?
It is true, but actually that's a pretty old number, I guess. So now it's about more like 20 million.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. So you have really gotten into this niche that apparently there is this audience for all over the world.
I guess so, yeah. Actually, one thing that I really like about this is that you can see the podcast like service that I use actually shows you where people are listening to it. So it breaks it down by state in the United States.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother doing that with any other countries, but it shows you what, like what are the top 5 countries who are listening to my podcast.
Yeah.
And something that's kind of cool is that we might get onto this later, but I also have been doing philosophy in India, history of philosophy in India.
Yeah.
And it's actually true that you can see the listening numbers like by percentage are a lot higher in India than for that series of episodes than they are for the other episodes.
Well, your History of Philosophy in India series is actually the one that I found you for whenever I was looking for material that I could use in my own religious studies class. And we're going to get into that as well. So you have over 300 episodes between your History of Philosophy without any gaps and your History of Philosophy in India. I think it's like 380 episodes by now, right?
It can't be that much, but it's I guess so. It's almost 300 in the original series.
Yeah,
and then I guess it's like almost 60 in the India one. So we're talking about more like 360.
Okay, cool. So this is an incredible amount of work. So what is your day-to-day life like with regards to like creating these 300 plus episodes? So like, how do you map out the project like before you begin recording, launching episodes? How do you decide on the order of topics? Like, where do you get your material? So I'm kind of like hoping we can get nerdy about your research and script process.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we can compare notes. You can tell me what you do.
Yeah, I can if you want.
Well, so there's a lot of steps that happen between thinking, okay, maybe we could take an example. So pretty soon I'm going to be covering Byzantine philosophy, because when I finish Latin medieval philosophy, the next thing I'm doing is Byzantine philosophy. So that's something I have a passing acquaintance with, but that's about it. So the first thing I would do is sit down with a blank screen and write down some ideas about what I might cover. I might then turn to a very general source, there's all these guidebooks and companions and handbooks and also website resources these days that are in a way also introductory, right? And so I would then maybe glance through some of those and see what they cover. And then I might try to figure out one or two like general books on the whole period, and I would read at least one book about the historical framework. So not Byzantine philosophy, but Byzantine history. And at the same time, I would read maybe 2 or 3 books that give you like an overview of Byzantine philosophy. In the case of Byzantine philosophy, that doesn't really exist actually, but that's the principle. So by doing all that, then I come up with a list, which is basically like a prospective table of contents. And then I send that to colleagues who are specialists in the field. So this is one advantage of being an academic, actually. Because, I mean, I don't know what would happen if you sent an email to an ancient historian and said, you know, look at my table of contents. I bet they'd be very helpful, actually, and friendly.
I think that they would. And I'm honestly amazed at how many people say yes and talk to me for this podcast in general. So, like, I've been really amazed by the academic and journalism and scholarly field with regards to, like, reaching out to me to help me do this podcast.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's been one of the best experiences for me as a podcaster is the generosity and enthusiasm of other academics. Because when I first started doing it, I thought they'd think, oh, this is kind of lame. Like, why are you wasting your time on this with this when you could do real research, you know? Mm-hmm. But actually, people have, at least to my face, they've been very nice about it. And in particular, they've been very helpful at all these stages. So I get lots of, I mean, I didn't really do this, by the way, with philosophy in the Islamic world, because in that case, maybe I did a bit actually, but I really needed help, for example, with Latin medieval, now with Byzantine, with Renaissance coming up. And so I just passed the table of contents past people. And then I have at least a kind of sketch of where I am going. Sometimes I do take things away or more likely add them. Once I start reading more deeply into the material, I might discover, oh, actually, there's this thinker who I wasn't planning to cover, but he or she really deserves their own episode. Or there's this whole movement, and actually I could cover these 3 figures all at once if I just talk about the movement as one episode, that kind of thing. So I shuffle around a bit, but usually it doesn't change that much from the original plan. And then I tackle each topic. So if you think about it, my podcast is weekly. So in a sense, I've got an average of 1 week to do each episode, which isn't very much. But I do interviews. So about every 5th episode is an interview, and that gives me some breathing space. And then basically, I'm just kind of reading, I start reading for the next podcast episode the day after I write the script for the last podcast episode. So it's just constant churn, basically.
So are your scripts basically first drafts for a book?
Yeah, although they're actually, I would say they're more polished than that. So the scripts all appear as a series of books with Oxford University Press, which is just called A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And that was not my plan originally. So at first I just thought I was doing a podcast. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of tell that, especially from the early episodes. I knew I wanted to have a script because I listened to a lot of podcasts. And I don't really like podcasts where people are talking off the top of their heads unless it's an interview. Yeah. I like a tight, scripted podcast.
Yeah, me too. So one of the things that's so impressive to me about your podcast is that it has such a wide audience. And one of the biggest critiques of higher education and the professoriate is that there's this disconnect between the academy and citizens around the world. And as you mentioned earlier, your listenership is pretty vast. So what's been your experience connecting with your listeners around the world, many of whom are not connected to academia in any way, I presume, based solely on creating this podcast?
That's actually been another one of the best things about it. In fact, I guess if someone asked me what is your favorite thing about doing the podcast, to be honest, probably the top thing for me would just be that I learned so much doing it. But the second and close behind would be that it's given me a chance to communicate with all these people that I wouldn't normally be able to sort of do philosophy with, if you don't mind me putting it that way.
Sure.
Because they're not even undergraduate students, right? They're not necessarily, they might be high school students. They might just be people who are listening to podcasts while they drive around or wash the dishes or whatever.
That's me.
Right. And in fact, it's me too, right? Because I'm like, I listen to podcasts when I go running, and I listen to podcasts about things like linguistics and history and sports, like all these things I'm not an expert on. So I'm in the same position for those podcasts as my listeners are for my podcast. And something that I was very kind of conscious of from the get-go is that I didn't want the conversation to just be kind of one way. It's like me telling them stuff and them not being able to say anything back. So pretty early on, a grad student of mine helped me set up a website where you can leave comments either in general, there's like a general comments page, or you can comment on each episode. And there's also, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, and I frequently ask the audience, especially on Facebook, I ask people for their views on things. Like, for example, when I was thinking about tackling Indian philosophy, I asked both on my website and on Facebook, I said, well, you're the audience. Would you think it was worth my stopping Western philosophy for like 2 years so that I could do 2 years on Indian philosophy, and then I would come back and do like medieval philosophy? So my idea was before I do medieval, I would cover Indian philosophy, and I would come back and do medieval. And that was very helpful because it turned out that half the people said, oh, yes, please do that. And the other half said, oh, for God's sake, no, don't do that. And so that's why I do what I do now, which is I alternate. So I have a 1 week is medieval, the next week is India. And I should say, by the way, that for India, I have a co-writer. So there's this professor from NYU named Janardhan Ganeri, who wrote the scripts for India with me. And I have another co-author for the next series on non-Western philosophy, and that's Chike Jeffers. And he and I will be doing Africana philosophy starting in spring of 2018.
That's amazing. So did you experience any kind of like skepticism from like fellow university-based philosophers about the project when you were starting it? Or was everybody like really on board with kind of what you were doing to like as a way to bring philosophy as a discipline like to the masses?
Yeah, I mean, I've literally never had anyone say anything to me negative about it at all, which really surprised me because, like I said, I thought people might be like, how is this a good use of your time? I mean, I suppose that the context here matters a lot. So, I mean, I was in the UK when I started it, and now the UK government is putting a lot of pressure on academics to show that they're doing things that have so-called impact on the wider world. And so this was a pretty clear case of someone trying to do that, and that has institutional support now. So it kind of fit into a slot that people could understand. So that was one thing. I think another thing is that if I had started doing this and completely stopped doing my normal research, then I would imagine people would think, well, basically he stopped being, I mean, at least some people might say he stopped being a proper academic and became a popularizer instead. And I have certainly heard academics say nasty things about other philosophers who are thought to be popularizers.
Gotcha.
Without naming names.
Sure, of course. So I've used your podcast in my own classroom in high school. So
that's awesome, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and they really like your work. So do you use your podcast as like a teaching tool in your own classes?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much recommend it in every class I teach. In fact, I usually recommend it within the first 2 minutes of every class I teach. And like I say, part of the reason for that is because I can say, well, here's what I'm going to be covering, but if you want to know about all this other stuff, go listen to the podcast. But recently, I actually developed a course for King's College London, which is going on right now, which is about women thinkers in antiquity and the Middle Ages. And I recorded some videos where I talked about some of the same things that I talked about with women thinkers in the podcast. And the idea is that the students would watch the video, listen to the relevant podcast, and have a meeting with like a teaching assistant who would actually discuss the text with the primary text with them. And that's how the course is delivered. So it's like audio, video, and a meeting with the teaching assistant. And so in that case, it's become integrated very closely into the teaching method.
I think that that's going to be like the future of school in general.
Could be, yeah.
I mean, do you see like universities like embracing these kinds of trends like around the world?
Yeah, it's already happening to some extent, right? With these massive online courses and MOOCs.
Yeah.
I guess the thing that I would worry about there is that when I think about my podcast as a way of delivering information or teaching, I guess I do think of it as a way of teaching, but I don't think it could be a substitute for face-to-face exchange between a teacher and a student.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have these meetings where the students meet with grad students to talk through the texts. So I think if you're just sort of passively listening to a podcast or watching a video, that's not a very good way of learning. It might be a good element in a course that has an overall structure that includes face-to-face learning, but I'm pretty skeptical actually about purely online learning, although they have developed these ways of doing it, right? Like they have the students interact with each other electronically rather than with a teacher. But I'm actually the irony here is that in real life teaching, so to speak, I'm kind of old school. So I really believe in, sitting down in a room with a small number of students and talking about Plato. That's still for me like the paradigm teaching experience.
So I've found your essay or your episode on the Jainism concept of ahimsa or nonviolence. The episode is called Mostly Harmless, and I think it was like number 9 or number 13 in your India series.
Yeah, it's early, right?
Yeah, and we read that together in class, and we use your podcast voice. So it's you reading and them looking at the page and annotating as you read, and then I'll take breaks every 5 or 6 paragraphs and let them do a little annotation on the script for how you have what they've liked about what you said and what they have questions on. So they're annotating along the way with your voice. And then I make them write these like little papers where they identify some of the most important details about their impressions of the text, questions that they have, ponderings on the topic, and they find it to be a really useful source. But one of the things that I've noticed about your podcast is that it's so detailed. So if somebody wanted to use some of your podcast episodes like in like a high school classroom, what are some of the episodes that you feel like are like most accessible to like older teenagers?
That's an interesting question. So I think actually the one you just mentioned is a good example, because I think I would go for the ones that are maybe not so much here's a figure or here's a text, but are thematic.
Yeah.
Like, for example, just leaping to mind at the moment, there's an early medieval one, which is about the problem of universals, where I basically just explain the problem. Here's the problem. So you've got these properties that appear in many things, like, the color red appears in all these roses. Is the color red a real thing over and above the roses? That's the problem. And there's different views that different people take. And then philosophers like Abelard or whoever come in as representing the different views, but you don't really have to listen to any episodes before or after. It's a kind of self-contained thing. You can listen to it. You can understand the problem, hopefully, and understand why different people took the views they did on that problem. So I think you could almost scroll through the list and just look at the titles and go for the ones that are about topics instead of people.
Yeah. Well,
that would work pretty well.
And some of the ones you've done recently that spring to mind about gender roles have been really amazing for like a conceptual discussion as well.
Yeah, I think of course it depends a lot on the topic as well, because if it's about how were women perceived in the Middle Ages, which is the one you just mentioned, or nonviolence, which obviously is a lot of that is about how we treat animals. These things are very vivid and familiar issues in everybody's everyday life. So you don't have to be, you don't really even have to be in any way philosophically inclined or curious about philosophy. You can still see it's a problem. Like, should we eat animals or not? We all know that some people are vegetarians, some people aren't. And we've all thought about that at least a little. So you've already started talking about nonviolence without taking a philosophy class.
Am I the only high school teacher who has ever made his teenage students read your essays and then write responses to your work?
You might be the only one who's done that. And by the way, I think that's brilliant that that's how you do it, because that really handles the problem that I was mentioning about passivity, where they're just kind of, if it just kind of washes over you while you sit there. I mean, I know, and probably you have the same experience. Like if you listen to a podcast, you don't really retain that much information, even if you listened attentively.
Right.
It's like, if I listen, like all the stuff I heard about ancient Rome, for example, I mean, I heard this guy do 170 episodes about ancient Rome, but I couldn't, if you asked me to like spell it out for you, I mean, what you get out of it is sort of the broad outlines, right?
Sure, yeah.
But you don't get this super, super detailed knowledge that you could reproduce on your own. Whereas if you make someone listen to it, but like look at it as they go along. And of course you can use the book versions to do this.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I wanted to have book versions. Then it might stick better. But to answer your question, I have actually heard from other high school teachers who do use it, maybe not in quite the same way, but they'll, have their students listen to it and then maybe have them read something about the same topic and come in, and it's used in universities as well.
I love it, and they loved it too. Whenever we did that, we had one of the best discussions I've ever had this whole entire school year about ahimsa because of that essay. And then they wrote essays about it, and then I sent you some of them. And my favorite comment from your email back to me was, you can feel them thinking live in real time.
Yeah, and that's what's great about teaching, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did you ever do any promotion for this podcast, beyond just releasing it and telling your friends about it? Because 20 million downloads is that's so many people.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I remember when I sort of launched the first ever episode.
Yeah,
it was like, okay, this is now on the internet, but the only one who knows about it is me. So now what? And I was pretty clueless at the beginning. So eventually I got on Twitter and Facebook, neither of which I was on. I mean, first of all, I'm not the sort of social media early adopter kind of guy, as you might have guessed. And also, this was back in 2010. Okay, so Facebook was already a thing, but Twitter, I'm not sure Twitter was so much of a thing then.
I think Twitter came out in 2007, but it was, it took me a long time to do both as well.
Yeah, anyway, I came to that pretty late. And so now I have, what I do is I announce I announce every new episode on both Facebook and Twitter, but I also keep up I'm a pretty regular Twitter user, and I pretty much only tweet about things that are related to philosophy, or the furthest I would get away from that is things that are in jokes in the podcast, like Buster Keaton.
Yeah.
So I would tweet about Buster Keaton, but I don't tweet about my political opinions usually or anything like that. I just, keep it to philosophy. And it's pretty much the same on Facebook. So I really only use those as instruments for promoting the podcast. But I think also merely like what I was saying before about interacting with the audience on the website. So I put up blog posts. For example, I did this series of blog posts that got a lot of attention, I guess, called 20 Rules for Doing the History of Philosophy.
Oh, cool.
So there were 20 different posts, and I eventually combined them all into one place. And it basically goes through, it's sort of my method as a historian of philosophy and things that I think people should try to do when they're doing history of philosophy in order to get the best results. And that got a lot of good feedback and discussion. So that kind of thing also, people who don't know about the podcast might see someone link to something like that, and then they might find out about it, that sort of thing.
So this is a truly word of mouth endeavor.
Yeah, I don't know. I certainly have never, for me, it's never been about money. So I've never tried to make money out of the podcast, nor have I ever put any money into the podcast. So I never paid Facebook to boost posts about it or anything like that. But actually, I kind of think that this just works. If you, at least with podcasts, and maybe it's the same thing with YouTube videos or whatever, if you put something up and it's pretty good and you don't bail on it after 6 months, because I think that's the problem with a lot of podcasts. You see, I think it's called pod fade.
Yeah.
So where someone sort of launches a podcast and is going really well, and then they just find out how time consuming it is. And I actually thought about it very, very hard before I started. So, I really decided I'm going to do this and I'm not going to stop. So if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. And I think actually one thing I did get as a kind of sort of being teased when I first started it was that when I numbered the first podcast, I called it 001.
Yep.
And someone said to me, boy, you're pretty confident that you're going to make it to 100 episodes.
Yeah.
And now I'm almost at 300 episodes. So it turned out to be, I mean, I need the numbers. So it turned out to be a good idea. But I mean, that shows you that I really was thinking about it in terms of something that I would do for years when I started, because I knew that there was no point in doing it unless I was going to, I mean, the rate I go, it's taken me 300 episodes to do ancient philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and medieval philosophy, right? So that at that rate, I'd be lucky to get to 20th century philosophy within 1,000 episodes, right?
I mean, and it is just such a comprehensive, in-depth look that is free to anybody out there. I mean, you are getting top quality scholarship and research for free for any listener out there, I mean, who would find this thing. I mean, you really can't do much better than that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's certainly the ambition. I guess, I mean, the thing that I do sometimes worry about is, you know, do people want this much? Like, do they want a whole episode on, like, the one that's coming out next Sunday is John Wycliffe. And if you ask me to explain to you why there should be an episode on John Wycliffe, I can easily do it, right? He's like this hugely important figure who anticipates the Protestant Reformation, very influential, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, it's not like when people sit down and even if they came up with the top 50 figures they think they might want to know about in the history of philosophy, probably none of them would put John Wycliffe on there, right? But the hope is that people kind of follow it and they get swept up in it and they can kind of see as I go from episode to episode that it's making sense and it's not too detailed.
Yeah.
But people do sometimes say, you know, do you have to go this slow? When are you going to get to Hume and Kant?
Yeah. Side note, I lived in a building when I lived in Guildford in Surrey, England, called the Wycliffe Building. So,
oh, wow.
Yep.
So you're really looking forward to it.
Oh, yes, very much so. That'll be my number one most high priority next week. What has been the most surprising thing to you in the last 8 years about this podcast and book series?
I guess I would say that because you get numbers, right? You get download numbers.
Yeah.
And the download numbers, actually, there's two kinds of numbers. If you want to get nerdy again.
Yeah.
And I know you do.
I love it. Bring it on.
So I have two kinds of numbers. I have the numbers of downloads off the RSS feed. Mm-hmm. So this would be like if you're subscribed to it on iTunes or something.
Yeah. That's
the RSS feed. Then there's the website, and you can see how many people have seen each page. And those are separate, right? Because it's one thing to download from an RSS feed, another thing to go actualize a web page, right?
Yeah.
And the feed is pretty consistent in numbers because it's mostly subscribers. So you get bumps up and down if the topic's really exciting or really apparently not exciting. But you can really see from the website what people are interested in, because you can immediately see like one episode will get twice as many views within a week as another one.
Yeah.
And so that actually, I would say the most surprising thing has been seeing some of the things that did and did not get a lot of attention. And of course, the other thing about this is that it's not because of the way that I've handled the material, right? Because they have to go to the page in order to hear it.
Yeah.
Right. So they've gone to the page before they've heard it, right? So the numbers have nothing to do with the content of the episode. It only has to do with the topic. And so, for example, I was really amazed how much people love Seneca.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I wasn't maybe totally astonished, but he was so much more popular than any other late ancient philosopher. That surprised me. Like, for example, he's a lot more popular than Marcus Aurelius. Like, really? Okay. I mean, this just makes no sense to me at all. Like, you'd think anyone who's interested in Seneca would be interested in Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. They're all Roman Stoics, but apparently not. And I was very surprised recently that I put up this episode that actually has the word sex in the title.
Yeah.
This is this thing about sex and gender in the Middle Ages. And I figured, okay, this is going to get, unprecedentedly high numbers.
Yeah.
And it did get very high numbers. But then I put up something right after that which is an episode about whether Indian philosophy influenced Greek philosophy. And that got, even though that's been up for less time, it's got higher numbers than the sex episode.
Huh.
So as I said on Twitter, I have now discovered that people are more interested in whether India influenced Greek philosophy than they are in sex.
Good. I mean, maybe there's some hope for our society. Are there any episodes that you feel are like really overlooked that you were like really proud of, but like hasn't gotten the listenership? That's kind of like, is it like heartbreaking a little bit that it's like really low?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much anyone that's below average. Usually, though, I would feel that way more about the interviews because, in a way, my favorite episodes are the interviews because, you know, the other ones are just like the scripted ones is just me writing stuff and
right.
whatever. But the interviews, and I think actually a lot of the academic listeners feel this way about it, that the most cool ones are the interviews where you get to hear these scholars and actually hear what their voice sounds like.
Yeah.
And so, and I actually get the impression that in general, interviews are slightly less exciting for the listeners than the scripted ones. In fact, just going by the numbers, I would say there's probably quite a few listeners who just kind of keep up with me but skip the interviews.
Huh. Interesting. I really liked the episode you did with the scholar recently on Sufism and Rumi. What was his name? Reston?
Muhammad Rustam.
Yeah, that was a really wonderful conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and go against that trend and say that I like your interviews a lot.
Yeah, I like them too. I mean, of course, for me, it's like it's the chance for someone to be on there who has some things to say that I don't know or that I wouldn't say myself.
Yeah.
And so in a way, they're the most interesting ones for me.
You've said a lot of things during this conversation that I am, that I can jump off from and learn more about myself. What have been some of your favorite or least favorite topics that you've covered?
Well, so one thing I should maybe go back to is this thing about interacting with the audience.
Yeah.
Because I actually had some blind spots going into the project, or not even blind spots, but things that I just didn't think I was going to cover. So in particular, I actually said in the original version of episode 1, I later re-recorded it to get rid of this. I actually said explicitly that I was not going to do Indian or Chinese philosophy because I was completely ignorant about these topics, which I thought was like an incredibly good excuse.
Yeah.
So my attitude was, yes, someone should do an Indian philosophy podcast, but obviously not me. I don't know Sanskrit. I don't know Pali. I don't know any of the other languages that are relevant. How could I possibly do that? And almost immediately, I started getting the criticism, and it's probably the only sustained criticism I've ever gotten of the project, was people saying, how can you call this the history of philosophy without any gaps if you don't cover India and China?
Yeah.
And I said, well, without any gaps doesn't mean that. It means that it's historically continuous.
Sure.
That's not what I meant. And they said, we don't care. You can't keep calling it that unless you either retitle your podcast or do India and do China. And then then what happened is that once I started getting into some areas of philosophy that I didn't know very much about, like late ancient Christian philosophy, later Islamic philosophy after the classical period, etc., I just thought, I'm spending so much time covering stuff I don't know very much about already. Why not do Indian philosophy? But I didn't, like I said, I didn't think I could do it by myself. So I got a co-author, Janardhan, to help me with it. And it is mind-blowingly interesting. I mean, as you said, this thing about nonviolence, but it's not just, that's a really easy sell, actually, the nonviolence. But no matter what area of philosophy you're interested in, ancient Indian philosophy is just, it's basically like discovering that ancient Greek philosophy happened again somewhere else, but with different positions and ideas.
Yeah.
Right? It's just as rich as ancient Greek philosophy. And even going into it, I thought, this will probably be pretty interesting. But my mind was really blown once I started doing it.
Well, when I discovered your work, the History, Philosophy, and India podcast channel was the only channel that I listened to you for ages. Mm-hmm. So that was the one that I was exclusively listening to you for a long time. Mm-hmm. So, you're totally covering something that's really amazing there, and that is such a cool distinction. What's your most popular episode?
Well, it's just the first one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you go by numbers, because the longer it's up, the longer they're up, the higher the numbers.
Yeah.
And second of all, I think a lot of people start out listening to podcasts and then they don't stick with it because they don't like it, or they have other things to do, or it's the kind of thing you sort of decide to do in early January. I'm gonna listen to all of the episodes on this 300 plus episode history of philosophy, and then you get to episode 3 and you're like, forget it. I'm gonna watch Friends.
Yeah. So, Professor Adamson, thank you so much for your time today. I'm curious if you could just tell people where to go if they feel like binging your hundreds of hours of audio instead of watching Friends, and where can they find you?
By the way, Friends, very good show.
Absolutely.
Shouldn't demean Friends.
Classic.
Yeah, Joey, Rachel, the whole gang. Yeah, so so the website is called historyofphilosophy.net, and it has links to the RSS feed on it. I guess, if you go into iTunes or something, if you search for History of Philosophy, you'll find it. You can actually, though, you can just find it by going into Google and putting History of Philosophy. It's the first hit.
Awesome. And what are your books that you think would be useful and accessible to listeners?
Like we said before, the podcasts actually appear as books. Obviously, there's some lag time, but the first 3 volumes are out. So there's Classical Philosophy, Philosophy in the Hellenistic and Roman Worlds, and Philosophy in the Islamic World. Those are all out. And pretty soon they'll all be out as paperback even, so they're pretty cheap. In addition, I have a book called Very Short Introduction to Philosophy in the Islamic World, which is basically the material I cover in the Islamic episodes, but scrunched down to like 1/5 the length.
Yeah, it's like 120 pages.
Yeah, and they're small pages as well.
Yeah,
and that book, I think those books are literally designed to fit in your pocket, because they do fit in your pocket. That's a great series in general, actually.
And it's like, and they're like $8 too.
They're so cheap. I know. They're literally books that they put next to the cash register when you're on your way out the store to buy like a pack of gum. You buy a very short introduction.
Yeah, and that series has got tons and tons of volumes. So what are some of your future projects that people can expect from you in the next couple of years?
Well, in the non-Western strand, once we're done with India, which is happening very soon, we're going to move on to Africana philosophy. I'm doing that with Chike Jeffers. And so that begins in ancient Egypt, goes on through Ethiopian philosophy. Yes, that exists. It goes up through then other philosophers and philosophical movements and trends that happened in Africa itself. And then it covers philosophy in the diaspora of the African peoples through slavery and migration to Europe and North America and elsewhere. And so it goes all the way up to now, basically. That's the projected goal. So it covers everything from ancient Egypt to Malcolm X, so to speak. And then in the Western, or whatever you want to call it, I don't really like calling it Western, but I'm never sure what else to call it. But the one that's not non-European, it's just about wrapping up with medieval philosophy, and then I'm backtracking and going back to around the 8th, 9th century, doing Byzantine philosophy, following Byzantine philosophy up till the fall of Constantinople, and then I'll do Renaissance philosophy. And I would say that Africana on the one hand and Byzantine and Renaissance on the other hand will both take about 2 years apiece. So I'll be doing that for quite a while.
Amazing. And then that's going to be your 10th anniversary with the podcast.
It will. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
Awesome.
I mean, that will carry me through my 10th anniversary probably.
Love it. Well, Professor Peter Adamson, host of History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, thank you so much for your time. And I am a fan, and I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your project.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on to say hi to your students for me.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is performed and composed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you would like to support this show, please subscribe or leaving a rating in iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.